Thank you very much for this most interesting talk, Simon. I would like to encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions via the Q&A function, and I'll read them out loud as soon as they arrive. In the meantime, just to break the ice, let me ask you, so I'll abuse my chair power and ask you a question. So your taxonomy of the three types of internationalism I found extremely interesting and thought-provoking, and especially the third column, so classifying them based on the dichotomy between capitalism and democracy and how. So there is a sense in which of the three, the one with the most unstable relation between capitalism and democracy is precisely the liberal variant of internationalism. So for the radical type, clearly democracy takes precedence, and that's a sort of a stable model, if you wish. Whereas, and the same goes the other way around for the right-wing internationalism. There is a sense in which in the liberal variant, capitalism and democracy just don't sit very well together. And one of the reasons, so one way to interpret the difficulties that you've traced of the liberal variants of internationalism in the last few decades is precisely to do with, in a sense, the inability of classical liberalism to deal with some issues that sort of become very relevant at the international level, whereas they can be sort of almost swept under the carpet at the national level. So let me mention just a couple. So the first one is the acknowledgement of deep imbalance of power. Power imbalances are very relevant at the national level as well, but in a sense, they are much less evident. So there are a lot of fora where people can express their views, one person, one vote. This is especially true at the local level, etc. At the international level, in a sense, the power imbalances explode in their relevance. So some actors are infinitely more relevant. So in the UN Assembly, it is true that every nation counts as one, but in the end, it's not true that every nation counts as one. So Fiji and China don't count the same way. Same goes with the United States and other nations. So that's one, power imbalances. The second one is literally at the theoretical level. I found it always, so one of the most prominent exponents of modern liberalism is John Rawls. He's developed the concept of what modern liberalism is. And I found it striking that his view of liberalism literally stops at the national level. So he explicitly denies that his theory of justice, which is considered to be the liberal theory almost by definition, does not and should not apply to the international arena. So all his theoretical constructs, the original position, the veil of ignorance, etc., is only valid for citizens of the same nation. When it comes to justice at the global level, he says that's just bargaining between countries, which has always puzzled Rawlsians of all varieties. So he has to build this extremely baroque two-stage procedure in his theory, whereby his original theoretical construct applies at the national level, and then something else happens at the national level. And my take on this is that democracy at the international level is actually kind of almost scary for liberals. The idea of this Moloch of an international global state might actually infringe on economic liberties that are equally cherished. And I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. I mean, some really good points. I think there's one area where both those observations come together. I think you're absolutely right. Power at the international level, in the way it's institutionalized, we can take the UN system as an example, one country, one vote, as you say, is democracy undermined by the reality of power relations. The inverse of that, which is your Rawlsian example, is that, democracy itself will do the undermining if you allow it to at the international level, and therefore you are best basically resorting to bargaining between positions. And Rawls' own take, as you get to on the efforts of his followers to scale him up to the global level and try to find a way of thinking through a Rawlsian solution internationally, was always hesitant, I think. And I think one area where they come together is actually, what in another language we would call governance. Not good governance, not like countries and states pursuing certain policies that we deem to be, proper and appropriate and well behaved. But I mean governance in the terms of structures, organized systems, and principles by which countries are able to cooperate in ways that are fair and that do justice to each of their respective and different needs. One example of this is the UN principle of combined but differentiated responsibilities that you have in the climate discussion, for example, recognizing that not all countries are positioned the same way in relation to the problem. But that doesn't translate, and hasn't translated thus far, into actual governance arrangements for actual mechanisms which have actual power. So if you look at the way that WHO operates, if you look at the way the Global Fund operates, if you look at the way that you mentioned Sceptre before operates, if you look at the way the majority of international multilateral frameworks operate, it isn't one in which actually we have the kind of constituency level approach to voting authority and power and voice that we have at the domestic political scale. And so the reason I say this is because I think we're locked in this discussion, or have been for a long time, that if you want to do better internationally, the only thing you can choose between is ideal perfect type cooperation, which never exists because power always will out, or you have some kind of global democracy. We had these debates in the 1990s ad infinitum, which is itself so abstract as to be meaningless and falls prey to the arguments of those that are against it, because it allows them to say, well, one person's going to be deciding the fate of millions of people. That's not how we want to be governed. What we don't have is the sort of representative constituency type based approaches to governing international organizations and the processes that they relate to. And that is part of the area, I think, that a civic internationalism would be very much focused on doing. It would be looking at the way in which we could organize governance so that, for example, countries pay their fair share, not simply one country, one vote, but a portion that relates to their GDP, to some element of their population size, that we can find ways of using the structures and the systems we already have at the national scale to settle these very problems. We have federalism, for example, in a number of countries, particularly larger ones. There are lessons from federalism that can be applied to the international scale that would allow cooperation to be much more productive. But what we haven't done is dared to sort of put that into a framework where we can say this is a way in which we could change the political relations, change that false choice, if you like, between the Rawlsian solution that can't ever happen and the reality of the alternative, which is power will out. And I think that's the task that we need to do. We need to build the institutional infrastructure to enable power to be managed at the international scale. That's the sort of target, if you like, of what a modern day internationalism ought to be oriented towards trying to do.
And I think this leads us perfectly onto the next question, which comes from the audience. Julia asks, how does soft/cultural power of nations play into increasing a certain type of internationalism? And in your opinion, is it beneficial?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I mean, I think, soft power is what you have also at the we don't call it this, but it's what you also have at the domestic political scale. This is what the lobby system is. Lobbies are soft power. They are collected organizations seeking to influence a standard structure of a democratic arrangement, which is to say these senators will vote in this way on this issue. The task is to use your soft power, whether it's through money, whether it's through influence, whether it's through persuasion, to get those senators to vote in a certain way. Now, at the international scale, soft power tends to be leveraged between states, but there's no reason why it couldn't be leveraged in a more multilateral context where what we're trying to actually achieve is the provision of public resource rather than simply the outcome of yes, no, zero-sum calculations on whether countries go together or not to do something. The example, if you will, of Paris. The Paris Agreement, if it was organized in the sorts of multilateral, collective action approaches that I'm advocating for, would have been a very different outcome than the one we had. And I think in that process, the use of soft power, both at national level, but also between constituencies, between groups, between classes, is actually something that could be very useful.
Thanks. Next, Christy asks, is internationalism similar to the world order concept?
No, would be my answer. But it's an important question to ask. If, in a sense, world order is about single government. It's about the idea that there is a singular framework that works for all countries. Now, we have the United Nations as a system which allows countries to negotiate on certain issues and to promote and secure certain things that they all need in common. That's not the same as world order. World order is often what certain visions, geopolitical visions we talked about before, seek to try to impose, so that one group comes out of that world order better. One group sits at the top. One group is able to charge rent. One group is able to secure the benefits that come from the rules of that world order. That's what we've had, but we see it in terms of imperialism in the past. We see it in terms of global economic hegemony, in the choices that some countries have and other countries don't have. But what we want is something where all countries get to, as it were, be themselves and have equal opportunities to explore and to protect and to provide for their own citizens on fair terms with others. And that is partly about changing the ways in which we organize the international economy. And it's also partly about changing, as we've been talking about, the ways in which we organize the political procedures by which countries come together and negotiate. Now, there are no simple answers to either of those things, but there are suggestions. And those suggestions really ought to be thought through and developed and brought to the table, because if we don't develop new ideas, new procedures, which in a sense we did do quite dramatically after the Second World War, around the Bretton Woods founding, around the establishment of the international economy as was then, but which we really haven't tried to do much since. And I think the current moment, the upheavals, the extent to which liberal internationalism, in the way I was describing, has really kind of run its course, all of that leads us to think, in my view, that it's time to begin to come up with some sensible, constructive suggestions, to dare to be a little utopian in the way that we once did, but in order to secure a way of working in the present, which is going to be much more amenable to solving the great challenges from climate. COVID is one example, but climate is going to be a much bigger challenge in terms of international cooperation. And the way we've currently addressed the COVID response does not give us much hope to think that the current structures are up to a challenge of that scale. And if that's the case, then we really do need new ways to think. We need to be a little naive, and we need to dare to think that there are better proposals that we can push for. And that requires civil society getting behind it. It requires thinkers getting behind it, and it requires governments and politicians getting behind it. And that's a process that's got to happen. But we've been too cynical, I think, for too long about how we address these problems. The long history of socialist politics that sort of transcended and turned into sort of third wayism, which was in a sense a kind of capitulation to the realities of conservative politics of the time and an acceptance of their terms of the argument, is a classic example of the direction we have gone in. And I think we now need to go in a different direction, and we need to bring forward some of those ideas so that we can establish the structures and the processes and the procedures that we need if our countries and governments and representative organizations are going to figure out the problems before us.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I have another question for you, not from the audience. So how do you see the new multipolarity and internationalism together? Particularly, is the rise of China helping or hurting the chances of a progressive internationalist movement?
This is interesting. How do I see it? I think in a way, I don't know how new the rise of China is in terms of some of the things we're discussing here. I mentioned very, very briefly in passing the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is still, in a sense, I mean, it's a Chinese approach to international capitalism. It's a Chinese approach to the developmental project that Western nations have pursued since the 1940s and 50s. But in a sense, it's still the same thing. It's still one country seeking to be the benefactor of other countries. It's still in the ODA mold, the Overseas Development mold. It's still, as it were, the opposite of what I'm advocating for, which is that we need to find ways of creating universal engagements where all countries have a meaningful say. The proposal that I and colleagues have been working on around global public investment is very much the opposite of an ODA proposal, because it's not about donors and recipients. It's about universal contributions, about even the poorest countries being part of a system, even if their contribution is very small, so that they can be there also in the governance, to have a say in the decisions, and therefore to ensure that their interests are representative. This goes back to my point about building constituencies and ways of articulating the needs of constituencies at the international scale. That's what we don't have. It's what the UN system doesn't at present provide. And it's what any of the other multilateral arrangements, which tend to be organized through funding by countries where it's very bilateral, it's very directed to particular ends. Funding of the WHO, for example, is predominantly countries saying, you can have this, but it's got to go to that end that we want to support. WHO itself has very little budget with which to form its own policies. That's what we need to change. It's what the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't take us in the direction of doing, but it's what a better multilateral form of collective action would enable us to do. And that's what I think, that's where a modern civic internationalism is needed, to try to promote those ideas and to share experiences across nations, across cultures, to be able to bring that together.
Thanks. Another question. What are the similarities and differences between the current version of neoliberal reactionary right-wing internationalism from Bolsonaro to Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Boris Johnson, and the rest, and the fascist internationalism of the 1930s, in your view?
I think there are some parallels. I think not least, fascist internationalism, which sought to bring together a set of nationally differentiable but ultimately quite similar views around collective belonging, collective rights to belong, drawn upon whether it was racial or other socially determined lines, and neoliberalism, which does a similar sort of thing, but it does it through the more technical language, as it were, of economic rights and belonging, but which still ultimately excludes. That still is a politics based upon the exclusion of some and the privileges of others, depending upon that exclusion. So to that extent, there are some similarities, but ultimately the two also come out of a slightly different context. Yes, there are similarities in the sense that the two are anti-democratic to some degrees, but in different ways. There are anti-democratic arguments in fascism which are quite distinct from those in neoliberalism, but they do share the sort of concern you were mentioning before, Roberto, about the fear of what democracy can do, the danger, as it were, of democracy. And this has long been an argument thrown against democracy, back from the French Revolution onwards, really. There are forms of democracy that can be mob rule, no doubt about it. But an informed democracy that is transparent, that is based upon meaningful representation, that's based upon constrained political decision making, that isn't able to, as it were, resort to minority leverage over majorities, or the inverse. Those are things that we've already figured out, that we already have good ways of addressing. Doesn't mean they always do, doesn't mean that the systems aren't imperfect in many ways, but we have solutions to those problems. And so the point of drawing the comparison, I think, is valid, because it shows us that there are legacies of anti-democratism that flow both from fascism, from neoliberalism, from communism too, in different ways, actually. But there are also ways in which we can resolve each of those problems, that we have resolved them, And while we've done that predominantly at the national scale, that's where we've been most successful. We also need to think now about how we translate some of those lessons to the international scale. And again, this is where I think a civic democracy can be valuable by drawing those lessons together and by translating them into the actual tasks that confront us at the international scale. So no longer simply trying to assert one coalition's concern, one particular constituency's concern over another, and using the international stage to leverage that to achieve it, but now saying, how can we use international cooperation to achieve some of the things that if we don't achieve, we're all going to suffer from. COVID was a wake-up call on that front with vaccine nationalism. Climate is going to be an even bigger one. And so this is why I think the project of modern day internationalism becomes actually pretty urgent once again. And it's why, though it's not a very popular topic, as I said at the start, it doesn't feel like it's the best of times to be talking about internationalism. We split mostly between globalism and nationalism these days, but I think internationalism is important because it allows us that middle ground where we can actually affect politics between nations, across nations, and for people. And that is, in a sense, actually what I think internationalism's great promise remains. And that's what I hope we can find ways of talking through in fora like this and others, and really bringing up the agenda.
Thank you very, very much, Simon, both for a great talk and a very interesting Q&A. I think by the Geneva Convention, which is one of the pillars of the internationalism, we should let the speaker go. So thanks again, and thanks to the audience for staying with us. And let's end on a very positive note of hope for a renewed form of internationalism. Thanks again, Simon.
Thank you, Roberto, and all. Really appreciated being here.